He is, our presenter is Bob Pearson. And Bob is a photojournalist, commercial photographer, instructor, and consultant for over 40 years of experience in news photography, covering sports, politics, and social issues worldwide. Bob began his career at newspapers in Nebraska and Florida. He spent 21 years with, and I was going to say it with a French accent, Agence France Presse, AFP, the French International Wire Service. He served as staff photographer based in Miami and covering the Americas, then chief photographer and director of photography for AFP, covering the White House and Capitol Hill, and coordinating coverage for North America. Pearson's photographs have been published worldwide, including major newspapers and magazines such as the New York Times, USA Today, Time Magazine, Newsweek, US News and World Report, Paris Match, Der Spiegel, and numerous websites. Bob is currently based just outside of Denver, Colorado. Thanks for coming.
Good evening. Thanks for coming. My name is Bob Pearson. We live in Indian Hills. My wife Cynthia Hunter is back there. We're both photographers, but my career is primarily in photojournalism. And I wanted to share some pictures. Thanks to Evergreen Camera Club, and thanks to Tom, and thanks to Tina for inviting me on this little occasion. Let me share, and I'll try to get started here. Here you go. So, I think I would kind of like to get rid of this. Yeah. That little dash there. A little dash. There you go. Okay. Let's try this again. So I've been a photojournalist pretty much all my life. I kind of got a late start in college, but when I discovered journalism and photojournalism, it just took off. So what I want to do is show you some pictures from my time in Nebraska, also in South Florida. I lived in Naples and Fort Myers for a while. When I worked for the Agence France Presse, or AFP, as it's going to be called from here on out, I did a lot of sports coverage, golf, baseball, Olympics, a lot of conflict coverage. This is from the first Gulf War. And I spent a ton of time in Haiti from 1985 until about 1995, essentially. One of my favorite assignments was covering the space shuttle in Kennedy Space Center in Florida. If we have time at the end of this, my wife and I just got back from Kenya, and I'd like to show you some pictures from all that too. But let's start with Nebraska, where I went to school at the university. I had a couple of heroes when I was studying photography. One of them was Eugene Smith. Has anybody heard of him? Eugene Smith was a photojournalist in the 1940s and 50s. He got severely injured in World War II in the Pacific. And 2 years later, when he went back to photographing, he photographed his daughters walking through a forest, and just a beautiful, beautiful photograph. This is from Lincoln, and when I saw these two girls, I immediately thought of Eugene Smith, and he has been one of my heroes, still is. Of course, coming from Nebraska, I grew up on a farm. Tractor pulls were always a big thing. And I worked for two newspapers in Lincoln, Nebraska, the Lincoln Journal and the Lincoln Star, and also for the Daily Nebraskan. And so I did a lot of this type of coverage, a lot of sports, of course, Nebraska football. A lot of you probably don't care about that, but and as a student photographer at the Daily Nebraskan, we often fought to cover musicians when they came to town. This is Jethro Tull, Ray Charles. How I got stuck with this assignment, I don't know. This is not a musician. This, this named himself Storming Alligator. And I looked on ChatGPT. His name was registered in Lancaster County, Lincoln, Nebraska, as Master Storming Alligator. Why he did this, I don't know. He was a rabid environmentalist, a bit of a self-tattoo artist, as you can see. And had some weird art too, but we did a lot of this type of portrait, and it was great training down the road for using direct flash, using off camera flash, that sort of thing. Just getting started in that early on was a lot of fun. In 1979, I moved to Florida, went to work for the Naples Star in Naples, Florida, and also for the Fort Myers News Press in Fort Myers, Florida. So we did a lot of local coverage here. This is Collier County Sheriff Aubrey Rogers with his most recent bust of a Quaalude shipment that was coming in. So much for the security of evidence, but he was proud to show it all off. And drug busts were very common there. This is me out in the Everglades. I went with Collier County Sheriffs, and we found these marijuana plants out in the middle of the Everglades. These things were 3 times taller than I was. It was a good place to grow marijuana. Of course, we did a lot of features then. Living on the beach, there were always surfers. Politics. Anybody remember John Connolly from Texas? He was campaigning in Naples at that time. And of course, Barbara and George Bush came through Naples as well. This was back in 1980 when George Bush was running against Ronald Reagan for the presidency. Lots of fashion. We did a lot of fashion work there, both at the Fort Myers News Press and at the Naples Star. A lot of beach fashion. And I went out one night with a couple of guys. They were looking for a nuisance alligator, and they promised me they would catch one. Well, they caught one. I don't think this guy was a nuisance yet. He wasn't quite big enough to be a nuisance. But this is the only alligator they caught that night after being out there for 8 hours in the dark. One of the things, has anybody been to Naples, Florida? One of the things that's really popular down there, and I think it still is, are swamp buggies. Swamp buggies are essentially a boat on wheels with a big motor. And these guys have races twice a year, and they run through these flooded canals and to see if they can make it. Some actually do quite well. Some don't do quite so well. And some really make pretty dramatic photos. This is all taking place in the Naples and Fort Myers area. And during that time, I did some freelancing for Associated Press as well. This is the German Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt. He was Chancellor back in the 80s. I got a call from Associated Press to ask me to go to Sanibel Island and get a picture of this, this Chancellor and his wife walking on the beach or doing whatever they were doing. I made this photograph, and I transmitted it, and I made it just in time for the morning editions of the German newspapers. And it was in almost every German newspaper the next day. Suddenly, I get a phone call saying, well, why don't you stay there for another 10 days and just cover the whole thing, which I did. The bad part of it was that every paparazzi in Florida showed up to cover the same thing. So it wasn't just me anymore. It was a big crowd. And so I stayed there for a few days, covered them. It was a lot of fun. It was a nice break from my normal routine. 1983, I was able to take a trip to San Francisco, and one of my other heroes was Robert Frank. Robert Frank? Robert Frank was probably the first street photographer of any name, and he put out a book called The Americans. One of the editions has a cover on it that's called Trolley New Orleans. It's inspiration for this. I saw this trolley in San Francisco, and I thought, Robert Frank, here's my homage to Robert Frank, my second hero. In 1985, I moved to Miami. I joined Agence France Presse, and we did a lot of local coverage there. I was based in Miami for 10 years. These are riots in Miami, which happened quite often while I was there. But we did a lot of coverage in Central, South America, and the Southeast US. And we often got requests from places like India. And this is one of the requests I had to respond to. Is in North Carolina. This guy that is in shackles here is the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He had a free love cult in Oregon at the time. The Americans didn't like him. The Indians wanted him shipped back. So he got arrested in North Carolina, and I had to go up and cover it. And of course, made an Asia Week magazine cover with it. One of the other regional coverages we did was in Oakdale, Louisiana. This was back in 1987. I don't know if you remember it, but the administration at that time had threatened to deport every Cuban that was in prison back to Cuba, which caused the Cubans in the Oakdale prison to riot. We weren't allowed to even get close to it, except we were allowed to walk up to the gate, and we could see the prison probably third of a mile, maybe half a mile away. So as a pool, when we pulled, one photographer was able to cover for everybody, all the other wire services. And this is one of the shots I got, sitting at the gate, shooting with an 800 millimeter lens. And these guys were just staring at me. I don't know if they knew I was there or not, but they were staring at me. These were some KKK demonstrations in Forsyth, Georgia in the late 80s. The first international trip I took was to Mexico City for the earthquake, 1985. And I didn't go there to photograph. I actually got sent there to pick up film. I got a call one morning. A couple of our photographers were in Mexico City, but there was no power, so they couldn't process film. There were no phone lines, so they couldn't transmit, even if they could process film. So I got a call from my office in Washington saying, Bob, can you find a charter jet and see if you can fly to Mexico City? I had just started. I said, sure, I'll try. And I just started with the company. I found a charter company in Fort Lauderdale that was more than happy to fly me there. They flew me in, to the General Aviation Airport. I hopped in a cab, went down to the International Press Center and found our guys, got their film. On the way back to the airport, I stopped in Zona Rosa, which is in the central part of Mexico City, and walked in and made a few photographs, and then ran back to the taxi and flew back home. Got in, I think I got home around 10 o'clock that night. My photo chief had flown down to Miami and processed film. We processed the film, we transmitted. I got to bed about 2 in the morning. About 6 in the morning, I got another phone call saying, Bob, can you fly back again? They still couldn't transmit out of Mexico City, so I flew back one more time. I almost didn't get to go because I had charged all this to my company, American Express card. And the woman on the other end said, Mr. Pearson, why didn't you just stay there? Well, we had to go through this whole explanation about why I had to go back. Well, anyway, we got cleared to go. Went back in, got more film, came back, processed it, and got pictures out. This was my photograph from the Zona Rosa. And it all worked out really well until I got the bill from American Express, which was about $17,000. This was from an earthquake in San Salvador. And this was a weird coverage because it was really hard to do. It was really hard to get access to anything. So I was there for 4 or 5 days. And on the flight out, we took a TACA Airlines. TACA is a Salvadoran airline. We called it Take a Chance Airlines. When we were taking off from Salvador, they took a bird through the port engine and bent one of the fan blades. And we had a scheduled stop in Belize. And once we were on the ground, it couldn't take off again because we only had one engine. They actually had to shut the port engine down because it was vibrating so much. The trouble was they tried to duct tape the fan blade to start with. We're standing in the door watching this and yelling at them. And there were US State Department people here. There were journalists, and we're all yelling, we're not flying on this. You're not taking off. They kept us on the plane all day. We landed at 10 a.m. We finally got off the plane at 7 p.m. after we had cleared out all of their alcohol, all of their food, watched every movie that they had. They finally let us off the plane and put us on a hotel overnight. This is this is actually in the evening. You can see that they have some fan blades there. They had to fly them in from San Salvador. And we finally took off the next morning. after they tested the engine with all of us in it, in the plane, of course. Hurricane Hugo, this is in Charleston. This was a weird situation because Hugo was a Category 5 hurricane coming in. It was Category 4 when it actually hit Charleston, but this was actually when the eye came over. This is the first time I'd ever been in the eye of a hurricane. Totally calm, absolutely still. And all of these rescue workers started bringing people in who had to be rescued from their homes. This poor lady had the roof of her house blown off. And she was carried into the hotel, into a sheltered area. And I was actually able, this hotel never lost power, never lost phone lines through the whole hurricane. I was able to transmit this from my room in the hotel before dawn, before I went out the next day to look at the damage. Of course, we had to do mundane things like Miss Universe. I got to cover the Pope quite a bit. This is from the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans. Also got to cover him in Venezuela. He made a South American tour. You can see he's crowded, all these folks crowded around with the Venezuelan flag. We covered a lot of sports too. And early on, we didn't have a big staff, so we got to do a little bit of everything. This is in 1985 from the I-75 World Series, St. Louis and Kansas City. This is a winning run by Kansas City. The guy missed the tag here, and the Royals won it. A little jubilation to go with it. And I was talking a little earlier with folks about skiing. I loved to ski back in those days. I don't ski anymore, but I loved to ski back in those days. And I begged to do World Cup skiing. And I finally I was able to do it, both in Vail, Beaver Creek, a couple of times in Whistler. But it's a lot of fun. You ski up or you take a lift up to the top of the race course and ski down to find a position. And hopefully you're in a good position where you can make a really nice photograph. In 1988, I was invited to go cover the Calgary Olympics. And for some reason or other, I got stuck doing short track speed skating. And I'm sure you've all watched it, right? Very small oval track. These guys go fast. We didn't have autofocus back in those days. And it was a pain. You basically picked a spot like that little marker right down there and wait for them to come into focus, and hopefully you can catch them at the right time. And this was the first time the Jamaican bobsled team had competed in the Olympics, which was a lot of fun to cover. These guys were great. Russia, US hockey. This is pretty indicative of how the game went. This is from the World Cup in Italy in 1990. We did a lot of golf coverage. We covered all the major golf tournaments around the world. And in the US, of course, that's the US Open. This is Lanny Wadkins from the PGA, or at the PGA Championship. But what we covered most diligently was the Masters tournament. And of course, here's Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer playing. This goes back a ways because these guys were still really mobile at that time. And this was actually, I think, before Jack Nicklaus actually won his last Masters tournament. This is probably the best picture I've ever taken from the Masters. This is Tiger Woods in 1997 when he won his first Masters. And that's his father, Earl, giving him a big hug when he comes off the course. This picture has shown up so many times, and it still shows up. And I'm just really happy with that. It's one of my favorite photographs from the Masters tournament itself. We did a lot of military coverage, and I got to do quite a bit myself. This is in Honduras. The U.S. was actually doing a training exercise with the Honduran army. This is back in the Sandinista days of Nicaragua, and this was pretty close to the Nicaraguan border. So I was out with these troops, and there were American troops there too, just to cover. We didn't actually get close to the border, but we actually covered them preparing and going to their camp. it was really kind of a cool situation because we got to see things we didn't always really see. This is, to me, was like something out of Apocalypse Now. It just made some really nice photographs. Just the things that they do in the military, pick stuff up and move it without any problem. These guys riding off the back of a C-130 plane with their little scout motorcycles. The whole thing was just amazing to me. It was just a lot of fun to cover. As I said earlier, I spent a lot of time in Haiti from 1986, right after the shuttle Challenger exploded, until about 1995, after the U.S. occupation there. This is one of my favorite pictures because it just shows what the street life in Haiti was like. These guys riding to who knows where on top of a sugarcane truck and all of that street business going on in the background. Really kind of cool. And then Haitian people are very kind, but they're also have a really violent side. And when violence hit Haiti, a lot of people got out of town. And we would see them quite regularly trying to get on these buses that they called tap-taps, trying to crowd their way on. They'd climb on top just to get out of town and get away from the violence until it was all over. But coverage basically started when baby Doc Duvalier left. And after that, they tried to have elections. There was a lot of violence around elections. But finally, around the late 80s, they tried to have elections. And just like anywhere else, they had political rallies, people out there worshiping their favorite candidate, people lined up to vote. And this is at City Hall in Port-au-Prince. This is the cool part. This is what always amazed me, was that people would walk in, fill out their ballot, and deposit their ballot. And as proof that they had voted, they would put their index finger in purple ink with the idea that, that was going to stay on for a while. They couldn't come back and vote again. Well, Haitians found out real quick that citrus juice would get rid of that ink. They would go out, wash off their finger, turn around, go right back in and vote again. All of that led up to, they had elections of presidents. They had, presidents who were thrown out of office by the army, and that sort of revolving, scenario kept going on. All this led up to 1983 when the UN decided they wanted to come in and bring in a peacekeeping force. This is the U.S. Embassy car here with the U.S. ambassador to Haiti inside. He was going to the port in Port-au-Prince to meet the UN boat coming in. Well, they wouldn't let him on the port. And they started a small riot there of people kicking the car. And finally, the ambassador had to leave to go home. They didn't let the boat dock, so the UN forces were forced to turn around. And of course, all of that led up to 1 year later of the U.S. occupation in Haiti. This is one of two covers I got on that particular photograph. And the U.S. military buildup started shortly after that, with Navy boats coming in, and ultimately U.S. occupation. This is a picture of U.S. Um, Army troops, essentially, essentially security police. They're protecting this guy on the ground. This guy was accused of throwing a grenade into a peaceful rally. And Haitians can be really kind people, but they also have a mob mentality, and they were going to kill this guy. So these guys, these military policemen, saved him. I never found out what happened to him after that. When I got there, I was standing in front of this guy with a gun, and I realized that it's pointing right at me. So I immediately ducked down, got on my knees, and took the picture from there. Other times that I've done this type of coverage, and you see there's a trend here. I'm doing less and less sports as time goes on, and more of this war type coverage, which I kind of got pegged for, and I wasn't opposed to it at all. But this was in Trinidad, and back in 1990, they had an uprising by a Muslim group who took over some of the government buildings. And by the time I got there, they had pretty much decided to give up. They weren't going anywhere. The army had overpowered them. And we got set up in the hotel in the evening. And the next morning, we went out with one of the attachés from the Trinidad Army. He took us out in the pouring rain to watch these guys give up, or these Muslims give up. It made a wonderful photograph, but it was pouring rain, pouring rain. I just had a little washcloth to cover up my camera, and shortly after I took this picture, it just died. Just died. It was raining so hard that it was resurrected. I put it under my foam dryer for about 4 hours, and it came back to life. But the funny part of this is that this was about the same time that Iraq invaded Kuwait. Same day, about the same time. The time difference, Iraq went into Kuwait at midnight. This was about 5 in the afternoon in Trinidad. So I was looking at my cohorts about, the guys from AP and Reuters, and they said, well, these pictures are going to go nowhere. And they pretty much went nowhere because the big story was, of course, Kuwait. And the next thing I know, I'm on a plane to Saudi Arabia to film the buildup for our desert storm. So I spent 2 months in Saudi Arabia, a little over 2 months actually, doing a lot of coverage of US Air Force, US troops, nothing of any note, so you won't see a lot of pictures of it here. But it was a good 2 months that I was there. And I stayed until Thanksgiving of 1990, when President Bush came in to be with the troops for Thanksgiving dinner. Shortly after that, I flew back to Miami. And I was watching TV and watching all this stuff happen over in Saudi Arabia and thinking to myself, I spent a lot of time over there. I would really like to go back and be there when it goes down. And so I called up the Washington office and I said, look, if you need me to rotate back in, I'm more than willing to go. And a couple of days later, I'm back on a plane. I mean, it really happened fast. They had guys that wanted to get out, and so I went back in. And I'm trying to remember the time frame, but I think it was 4 days after I landed. I was in a car loaded with a gear, and I was on my way to Kuwait City. We were one of the first groups to get into Kuwait City, and I was one of the first people to actually transmit pictures out of Kuwait City. This is from our first night there, US troops celebrating with the Kuwaiti resistance. And these are Kuwaiti guys welcoming the Allied army. It wasn't just the US going in, it was Turkish troops, a lot of regional troops from other countries going in as well. And that got a lot of play. We were actually a full 24 hours ahead of every other wire service in getting pictures out. And this is our crew. We actually found a hospital that had power. They let us come in, let me process film. And you can see that I've got my Inmarsat satellite phone there. Underneath that, on that table is our transmitting gear, but that's me on the right. That's Chris Lefko in the center. He was our reporter, and Christophe Simon was a French photographer for AFP that was there as well. And in the back, of course, is more Kuwaiti resistance. This was our setup. When we got into Kuwait City, the next morning we got right into downtown and we set up outside the International Hotel, which is where we stayed for the duration of our stay there. But you can see again, I got the Inmarsat sat phone set up. We had a digital scanner at that time. So we were processing negatives, but we were scanning them digitally into this machine. And we sent them back. You can see the modem on top of the scanner up there that transmitted at a whopping 2400 baud. Remember 2400 baud? It was really slow. We transmitted all night the night before, and we got 6 pictures out. That was that slow. Of course, they were color pictures, but that was good. And then there's Chris. He's transmitting his story out at that time. We stuck around there for the next few days. This is US troops taking back the US Embassy in Kuwait City. And we kind of toured the town. This is the Kuwait Sheraton. It was totally gutted, totally burned out. Of course, the Kuwaitis were celebrating. I don't know where they got that flag with Marilyn Monroe on it, but I thought it made a nice photograph. Again, more celebrations, lots of weapons around. And yeah, ultimately, it became an environmental story. Is if you remember that story, there were dozens and dozens of oil wells that were set on fire. And this is in the desert. The sand is normally brown. You can see where I'd been walking, but this desert was covered in black soot. Uh, and it was just an amazing scene. We probably went for 3 or 4 days straight with no sunlight, dark all day long, all night long, all day long, all night long. And like I said, eventually it became an environmental story, pumping oil out of the Persian Gulf. They had oil skimmers out trying to take some of the oil off the surface. I stayed there until troops started to leave. I was probably there for another 5 weeks after the city after Kuwait City was taken. And of course, then it was back to normal, doing politics. This was you worked for a French company, you got to cover the French president, and this is Jacques Chirac visiting Disney World, all places. So you get scheduled, and we covered a lot of campaigns. This is from one of the conventions. Don't remember exactly which one. It was one of the more recent ones, but this is Atlanta, 1988, when Michael Dukakis was nominated as a Democratic candidate. That's me. This was our working station. We're in front of the podium. Every Emmy, Martin Luther King staked it out a little bit. Really would have made a nice photograph, except the security guy right in the middle. And he had the guts to run us off. I was going to say he had something else, but he had the guts to run us off of there. He just got away, really destroyed a nice photograph. This was Clinton on November 4th in 92. The next morning after they had won the election. So it was, we had to do a lot of that sort of. In 1994, late 1994, I moved to Washington, D.C. I was a photo chief for North and South America. And this kind of started a new trend in my career where I was covering the White House all the time. So I got to travel quite a bit, especially with Clinton. I didn't travel that much with George W. Bush, and I was there for his first term. But I did travel quite a bit with Clinton. Went to Moscow 3, 4 times, I believe. This is me in Red Square. And this is Clinton with Pele in Rio. I had been used to photographing what I saw and choosing my timing and picking my photographs. And everything in politics is so orchestrated. It was kind of frustrating sometimes. It was really hard to try to find something unusual. What was unusual was scandal. And of course, this is Monica Lewinsky back in the day. She was brought into town to testify against Clinton. But like I said, we got to cover just about everything that was White House oriented. And this is from George W. Bush's second inauguration. From the press room. You're always looking for something different. Politicians were notorious. If they didn't like your question, they would go, huh, what? And then they would ask somebody else a question and veer off of it immediately. And that's kind of what he was doing here. So again, back to my favorite coverages, and that was the space shuttle. I covered, when I was working for the Naval Star, I covered the third launch of the space shuttle, and I was hooked. It was just such an experience. So when I joined AFP, that was part of our beat. And between the two of us that were based in Miami, we covered every shuttle launch from there on out, usually alternated. So we covered every other launch as an individual. But we covered everything. This is a shuttle, Columbia, in the reefer bay. They called it the orbiter processing facility. So we got close access to it. Got to see things like bringing back the booster rockets These fell off of the system at one point and dropped into the ocean. They would go out with ships and tow them back in to refurbish them and use them again down the road. These two fishermen just happened to be there and made a really nice photograph. Of course, we covered unmanned flights as well. These is a Delta II rocket. And this is a sort of an unusual thing. We got invited, and the Navy doesn't usually invite you to things, but we got invited to cover a test launch of the Trident II missiles. These were launched from nuclear subs. This one was launched from the USS Tennessee. And the Tennessee, these subs launched these missiles from about 60 feet below the surface of the water. And they're propelled up initially by a burst of air that pushes them above the surface. And once they pop out of the water, the engines ignite and they're supposed to take off. And normally they would take off on their program trajectory. Well, this one had a faulty engine nozzle and started to go in donuts. And it kept going and going and going until they actually blew it up. And I don't have the original photos from this, unfortunately. The company kept those, and I never did see them. But I do have this clip. I think it was from U.S. News and World Report. But it was one of the most unusual things we'd ever seen. And we were about a half a mile away photographing this from a Navy ship. When we did cover the shuttle launches, we did it from manned positions and we did it from remote positions. So basically, this was when we first got started. You could see we used a lot of plastic and a lot of duct tape to protect our remote cameras out here. They were triggered by sound. Essentially, we had microphones attached to triggers, which launched the cameras, basically started the cameras. We got a little more sophisticated and built boxes for them down the road, but this is what it looked like from a manned position, which was 2.5 miles away. The press mound was 2.5 miles away. We always got bad photographs. There was haze, there was heat waves. It was hard to say. And this was actually Challenger on its last flight, taking off. Our remote cameras, however, gave us a much better angle. Nice and sharp, just tack sharp pictures, beautiful color. And if it worked out right, if your camera's fired, it was worth waiting for them. This is from across the pond, looking at a profile of the shuttle. Of course, we covered the walkouts all the time too. This was John Glenn's flight back in '97. Our other manned position was on top of the VAB, which is a vehicle assembly building. It's 54 stories high. We had to take some elevators up to get to it, which is a little bit spooky. But once you get up there, you get a beautiful view of it, and you can see the horizon in the background. Really nice, crystal clear pictures. Very, very much better angle to shoot from than from the ground itself. And we covered landings. This one is probably the one time we were given this angle, and this is an access road where to carry the astronauts back came in, and we watched Endeavour land there. Beautiful, beautiful angle for it. This is a Challenger on its last flight. This is from a handheld position. And unfortunately, this is also from that handheld position of it blowing up. We had to stick around for quite a while afterwards and do pictures of recovery. They brought in debris for almost the better part of a month, I guess. I left AFP in 2006, moved to Austin to join my wife, Cynthia, and I started doing freelance work at that time. A little bit of everything. Did some commercial work, did some fun work. This is from South Park, of all places, in Colorado. We were living in Texas at the time, living near Austin. And so I did a lot of work for the Delta, and just some nice family pictures. This family was kind of weird. They had been living in a place called Zion Ranch in Texas, which was a polygamous cult. And they had had enough of it. Their family left. They moved kind of quietly and secretly to San Antonio. And I was asked to go down and photograph them to match a story that the Dallas Morning News did on them, made the front page. But it was really a fun story to do because I spent most of the day with his family and just made some really nice photographs of them. Of course, I got to cover hurricanes again. This is Hurricane Ike in Galveston. Somebody's always walking around with a flag in a hurricane just to try to get the picture taken, and it always works. So, and rescue after the storm had passed. We were fortunate, or I was fortunate enough to be there when the Spurs were making their run for the championship. So I got to cover a lot of Spurs action, and this was for a European press photo agency, another client of mine. And they gave me a lot of business over the years. We moved back to Colorado in 2010, and I got a phone call one night, about 2 in the morning. I looked at my phone. It was a 202 number calling, and I hung up. I thought, it's the middle of the night. Why are they calling me here? Who's calling me at this time of day? They called right back, and it turned out to be EPA again. And this was when the Century 16 shooting had happened, and they asked me to go out and cover it. So I went out, made a few pictures, and I spent the better part of 10 days, I guess, covering that from all aspects, the aftermath, and then eventually the trials that went with it too. And EPA always wanted coverage of candidates and presidents, and this is Obama in Boulder, Obama again in Denver. Anybody know what this is? January 1, 2014, the first sale of marijuana in Denver. And this poor guy had PTSD. He was an ex-Marine. He had PTSD. And so they sold him. He was the first one to buy marijuana. And you see the woman in the background there with the pink iPhone. That was his mom, just recording the whole situation. I thought that was kind of cool. And of course, Broncos. This is the Broncos parade after they won the Super Bowl. So that was it for my career, essentially.